Welcome to the Final Girls podcast. I'm Anna Bogutska, co-founder of the Final Girls Collective and your podcast host. To celebrate the release of AMULET in UK cinemas, we've got an exclusive interview with Romola Garai, the writer-director of this genuinely weird Gothic horror film that premiered at Sundance 2020 and finally hits UK screens. In this chat with Romola, we chat about female rage, about her love of horror, and some of the unique creations present in AMULET. Please note that the first half of the interview is not spoilerific, but we do make it super clear in our conversation when we're entering spoiler territory around halfway through our conversation. So after that moment, we talk explicitly about the ending of the film, and if you haven't seen AMULET yet, then I definitely suggest to watch the film first and then come back to this chat. The film follows a homeless ex-soldier who receives a mysterious offer to work as a carer for a woman and her dying mother. He soon falls in love with the daughter, but cannot quite shake the suspicion that there's something weird going on in the old house, which they all share. The film carries influences of body horror and fairy tales, but ends up going in a radically different and weird direction. If you enjoy this podcast, do follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Final Girls UK and consider leaving us a little review on Apple Podcasts. With all of that said, please enjoy my conversation with writer-director Romola Garai. Thank you so much for your time and for taking the time to talk to me, really.
Thanks, Anna. It's great to be here.
It's been weird. I've been hearing about AMULET for a while now, and your name keeps popping up as someone who's a big fan of horror. And I wanted to really start a conversation by hearing about your own personal relationship with horror.
Sure. Well, I think I suppose my earliest memory of watching things with creatures would have been The Dark Crystal, which had a big impact on me when I was younger. And then I think I watched a show called The Storyteller, which was on TV when I was a kid. And that was a Jim Henson piece, but they were fairy tales. Mm. And I really clearly remember watching those when I was a young child. And so I think it was always something that I was very attracted to. And actually, now that you know I have young kids myself, I kind of go back and I look at the things that I was writing as a child, and they often were things with creatures in them, stories with creatures in them. But then obviously, as I got older and I, started kind of working in film and stuff and became more aware of the work that I really liked and responded to, a lot of it was like Polanski, and The Tenant was a big reference for this film. And Possession was a film that I really love. I was kind of introduced to Cronenberg by a friend when I was a teenager, and kind of watched all of the Cronenberg movies and loved them all. So that was a big part. Those films have been a big part of my life. Dead Ringers is, I think, one of my favorite films ever made. And Possession, that was a big reference for this film. And Zalewski was obviously, that was someone I was introduced to when I started becoming more interested in film, when I started working in it. Mm. And so, all of those things were, I think, filmmakers that I really love and became really important in making this film. Trouble Every Day was a big reference for me. That was a film that I really, really loved. It's one of my favorite horror films. So they were all in there.
That's one of my all-time favorites. I think I never even actually thought about it as a horror film. It was just this weird nightmarish film that I almost thought that I made up in my mind the first couple of years.
I dream it? Yeah.
So I saw it in university at a really tiny VHS, and then I could never find it again. And I was thinking, I think I might have dreamt that. That's not a real film. But moving on to AMULET specifically, I'm always really curious, and I wanted to ask you about the origin story of this. So kind of, was there a scene, was there a character, or what came first in the story of AMULET coming into being?
Well, when I sort of sat down to write a horror film, I tried to do a bit of sort of free writing. I tried not to kind of over control it because I hadn't written a horror film before. This was the first time I'd tried to write a horror film. I had written sort of supernatural films, a couple of ghost stories, but nothing that was as much in this space. And like what came out was just a lot of rage. It's like quite an angry film, I think. And also something that I really kind of wanted to explore was the idea of the kind of tropes that we associate with kind of male and female relationships, you know, young man, young woman, and older woman. And exploring those, forcing the audience to kind of question their relationship with those characters and exploding some of the kind of myths around them. The film's sort of a bit about transformation, I think, about birth, and through the sort of agony of birth, the kind of a realization of a kind of trueness or a kind of true state that comes through that. So I guess it's a bit about birth and also a bit about kind of realizing your true self beneath your kind of disguise. So those are all sort of different themes that are going on in the film, I think.
And I wanted to pick you up on kind of on this exploding of the tropes, particularly that of the older woman, who very often is kind of, we're kind of socialized to think, oh, an older woman is always a protective figure. And Imelda's character in the film is kind of very much is and isn't at the same time. So can you talk a little bit about that, about her character in particular, and subverting that trope while at the same time leaning into it for a big chunk of the film?
Yeah, and also the older woman who's, you know, this kind of apparently abusive figure in the attic, and the idea of the evil queen and the evil stepmother and those sorts of things. So, yeah, I think what was important to me that when people sit and watch the movie, when, you know, two characters say there's an old woman in the attic who's like an irascible, angry, threatening figure, that you don't for a second kind of question that, because that's, you know, what happens when you go to the cinema. You absolutely accept that there will be an older woman who will be, you know, like making trouble for a young man in the pursuit of his kind of romantic dreams and aspirations, or like stepping in the way of young women and young men and their coming together. And I think that that's something that I really wanted to kind of examine a bit as to, you know, the reasoning behind that. And also, you know, it's all about this idea of him as a protector. That's the big kind of thing in the film, is that, like, you know, we understand, you know, threatening male characters, male violence to be kind of scary men who live in weird houses, who like wear weird clothes and stalk women at night. And like, that is just not the truth for most women. That is not, you know, the reality of living with male violence. I mean, in fact, it can be much more subtle. Women can live their entire lives with a man who thinks of himself as a provider and a protector, and actually is constantly policing women and, you know, and idealizing them. And it's through their idealization of women that actually they are kind of the most threatening. And of course, an older woman is not an idealized version of a woman. She's already a failure. She's already kind of broken the contract by getting ugly, you know. So those were all kind of ideas that I wanted to kind of explore and play with in the film, which are all really to do with how the audience relates to Thomas, who what they immediately understand him to be. And hopefully they immediately understand him to be this like lovely young guy who's just trying to help everybody.
I mean, it does help as well, the casting of Alec in this, who is just so charming and so lovely and has kind of such a positive energy as a performer, that it becomes a real kick in the teeth, really, when you start to question your own relationship and expectation of his character. But before we get into that part, which I think was a bit
unfair of me. I definitely have like a weapon, which is that I employ the most sympathetic man you could possibly imagine in that role. So yeah, okay, I maybe loaded my my gun a bit with that.
I mean, it's kind of really brilliant casting in many ways, but I want to get to his character kind of when we talk a little bit more about the ending of the film. But before that, it's very curious that you brought up fairy tales and kind of the more fantastical elements of horror that you were growing up on, because I got this distinct, very kind of fairy tale-esque aspect to the film when I was watching it, and I was wondering kind of which elements of those fairy tale that fairy tale imagery did you want to take in and upend in the film?
Yeah, so there's obviously, a man in a forest. Like these flashbacks, I think, are really significant because they are dreams. They're dreams, but they're also flashbacks. But I think that when we go into that space, I wanted it to feel like, this almost like a kind of medieval kind of glade, this very kind of nurturing, luscious kind of ancient forest, with this man who's a soldier, and that kind of like hopefully kind of, brings to mind the kind of knightly tradition and valor and protection and all of those sorts of ideas that we have, and a woman who's in need, coming to the aid of a woman in need. And so I think those were all there. Those were all in play, and the idea of the house being like a castle. There's a woman trapped in a house who can't leave, by an evil queen. Those are definitely fairy tale tropes, but they're also tropes that you see in every kind of contemporary film that you go to watch in cinema, and they exist in our conscious and our subconscious for a reason, because they're part of our kind of mythology. And that was sort of conscious and also sort of not conscious, in that, like I said, I kind of wrote the film very much without a sort of very strong sense of what I was going to write beforehand, and that was and those ideas, those tropes were kind of part of it.
And I wanna get into the ending and the kind of the latter part of the film. And I think this is very much a spoilerific section for anybody listening who hasn't seen Amulet yet and you want to avoid getting spoiled, then maybe switch off now and then come back into it.
Don't, yeah.
Once you've seen the film.
Yeah.
So with that said, like I mentioned before, there is kind of a two ways of approaching Thomas in a way, because you see him, you're introduced to him in one way, you have a certain set of expectations, and once we find out what he really did and what he's been carrying, there is an ickiness, I think, to realizing that you've spent so much time in the film next to a rapist who doesn't see himself as one, who hasn't accepted that what he did was wrong. So I'm wondering kind of how did you approach this in the script and also as a director with Alec?
Yeah, I think it was really great working with Alec. Something that I was very wary of, very worried about, was working with an actor who would see it as his job to kind of, and it's hard because your job as an actor is to kind of defend your character, but I knew that there were actors, and I knew that because I'd worked with actors like this, who would spend the whole time going, but, he was very fucked up at the time. And maybe we could have a line in there about how his mum wasn't nice to him. They would kind of take on the situation and see it as their job to kind of protect the character from any kind of criticism, because they are insecure in themselves and feel like they, are being criticized if the character that they're playing is being criticized. And I know people are going to think I'm crazy, but it happens all the time, and I think particularly for men, like, being in an environment where the character they're playing is like doing bad things or doing morally compromised things, like they can often spend a lot of time on set just like going like, but maybe we could have a line about how, the week before he delivered some shopping to an old lady. Like they're just trying to defend themselves, and we just didn't have the time to do that on set. There was never going to be that. So, when I sat down with Alec and I was like, look, this is a man who's committed a violent rape and he's got away with it. And he absolutely characterizes himself as a good person. He has locked away that event in a part of his psyche. He has entirely kind of sealed it off. And if you asked him whether he was a good person or not, he would say yes without a second's kind of pause or consideration. And Alec is such a kind of intelligent and emotionally secure man, that he was just like, yes, absolutely, that happens to all people, it happens to men and women. You can do a terrible thing and you can just seal it off. And I just knew that we would be great, we would be golden, that like he was incredibly trusting of me. It obviously goes to some very extreme places, the film, and and more than that, he just absolutely accepted this kind of basic fact about the character that he was playing, and didn't sort of feel like he needed to kind of justify himself, Alec, or the character particularly, that he just understood that there was that dichotomy at the center of who he was, and that was amazing, and took a great deal of faith in him, from him to me, and I'm very grateful for that, because he was brilliant in the film.
And I'm really conscious as well of the fact that the war that he has hanging over his kind of background is unnamed and fictional, but I'm very conscious that there is a legacy, especially in Eastern Europe, of having a very real of several generations of people kind of either growing up or living with the trauma, very often unresolved, of the legacy of war, and of people getting away with war crimes and not dealing with them either individually or socially. So can you talk a little bit about how did you think about that? Did you approach that in your research for AMULET?
Yeah, well, right before I had the meeting where someone was like, you should try writing a horror film, I read the book about the manhunt for Slobodan Milosevic. And so I was, I think, influenced by that. Mm-hmm. But I was also conscious that is I didn't want the film to be about that war. The film is not about that war. It's about any war. It could be any war. But I also couldn't set it in England, because I think if we were watching him walk through, a forest that was clearly the UK, then I think you sort of get into a kind of science fiction space where people are like, what war is that? Is that the future? Is that the past? So it's not a named war. It's a war that happens in somewhere that isn't England, but it also could be any conflict, in that, as we all sadly understand and know, one of the very first things that happens in war is that men use it as an opportunity to take revenge on women, or to sort of sexually abuse them. And then any society that's had a civil war then has to go through a process of deciding what to do about the people that have committed those crimes. Moving forwards requires massive individual suffering for people who are never going to get any kind of justice. But then if you put those people on trial, then potentially you risk the war never ending. That's obviously, comes at a terrific cost as well. And I don't obviously have any kind of answer to that extremely complex question. But I think the film expresses a sense of tremendous rage that I have about the fact that those crimes are often seen as the ones that are disposable. Sexual crimes are the ones that are usually seen as the ones that can be kind of characterized as livable with, existable with. And I think that and we see that even in societies that aren't at war, like even just our own society, that there's a certain amount of kind of like sexual aggression that's just accepted in a society as a kind of fact of life, and that it's madness to assume that women should live in a society where they wouldn't be catcalled in the street, or it's all part of a kind of vast continuum of male sexual entitlement that women are expected to live with. And I think that my anger about that, my sense of frustration about that, are all obviously things that are kind of like in the movie.
And I think, and I know we're running out of time, but I'd be remiss not to ask you about the ending. And it's really interesting to replaying it in my head as I hear you speak about this kind of this intense and kind of long-standing and I think quite universal rage that a lot of women feel on an everyday basis. And there is an element of that is coming through to me in that ending. And I don't really know how to ask you about it, because even as I was watching it, I was like, what
is happening?
It's kind of like a very visceral gut punch. And knowing that you were watching Cronenberg films, it makes a lot more sense. But I wanted to ask you kind of, where did this visceral body horror transformational ending kind of come from? And why did you want to end that film on that?
Well, I think so there's obviously a kind of there's a focus on the film in birth and the kind of primal agony of birth, and the fact that, you know, women are usually the ones who have to kind of experience the primal agony of birth, even if the sexual act is non-consensual, and that kind of idea is kind of turned on its head in the film. But I also think there's something about the sort of mythic power of the kind of eternal female, and, you know, the vagina, and like what I wanted at the end, although it's a shell, this thing that he crawls into is a shell, I wanted it to be like he was crawling inside a woman, and that Carla inside is like, you know, when we drew the figure for this kind of mythic creature, I wanted it to have the feeling of like a you know, ovarian, fallopian tubes and like an ovary, and like, you know, that he was crawling inside a woman and being punished by the kind of like the essential female, you know, that was the kind of idea. But hopefully those things are kind of suggestive, you know, because, you know, we did do versions of the end that were felt much more less sort of stylized, do you know what I mean? Like felt much more like graphic, like he was actually physically crawling inside a woman, and that there was a kind of punishing deity inside a woman. But we've ended up with something which is sort of suggestive of those ideas without being like, whilst at the same time being quite fantasy, like fantastical. But yeah, those were all the sort of ideas like going on inside my head, and obviously it's kind of cathartic, and it's, you know, it's just the idea of there being some kind of eternal punishment for those acts, and also the idea that women having a kind of a power inside their bodies, you know, that are usually sort of receptacles, and that actually that could be a place of kind of strength and of revenge.
Romola, thank you so much, and good luck with the release of AMULET as well.
Thanks so much. It's absolutely fantastic to be here. Thank you, Anna.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.